Ukraine just launched a historic attack on Russia, doing billions of dollars worth of damage to irreplaceable aircraft. What does this mean for Ukraine, for Russia, but also for the wider world? Could the United States find itself the victim of a similar kind of attack? We're going to look at this and more on today's Trumpet World. The news is dramatic. Russian nuclear bombers taken out with cheap drones. The supreme, fearsome behemoths of the past, the last generation's most powerful weapons, destroyed by something newer generations play with as toys. It's the latest and most dramatic picture of how technology is changing warfare. I've invited in Jeremiah Jacques and Josue Michels to come and talk about it. Welcome to the show, gentlemen.
Thanks for having me.
I'll start with a question, probably more to you, Jeremiah, as our Asia correspondent. Can you give us a bit of background into the attack and some more detail into what happened?
Sure, yes. Well, this attack has actually been in the planning phases for about 18 months. So it was just meticulously, fastidiously planned out to make it as surprising and as devastating as possible for Russian air power. But basically, there was a Ukrainian company that made wooden cabins. And some of these were sold inside of Russia, delivered there in large delivery trucks. And in this particular situation, the wooden containers that the cabins were supposed to be inside of were affixed to the tops of these delivery trucks. And the drivers of these particular trucks apparently didn't understand the true nature of the cargo that they were delivering. But once they arrived at their various destinations inside of Russia on June 1st, then Ukrainian operatives back in Ukraine remotely lifted the lid on these wooden containers and outflew dozens of first-person view quadcopters or drones. And as you say, these were just fairly standard drones, nothing, militarily advanced at all, probably $400 or $500 for each one, but they were carrying a payload. Each one of these had an explosive payload attached. So the trucks parked at their predetermined destinations, which were all very near to some of Russia's most important air bases. And then these lids lifted and outflew these drones, around 36 drones per truck, from what we can tell. And then the operatives back inside of Ukraine flew the drones over to the nearby bases and exploded each one of them on top of Russian warplanes. So this happened at 5 different Russian air bases: the Balaya base, the Diaghilevo base, the Ivanovo base, and also the Olenya and Ukrinka air bases. So altogether, we had 117 drones that were detonated, and Ukraine says that 41 Russian aircraft were destroyed or significantly damaged, including several of Russia's Tu-160s and Tu-22Ms, as well as the extremely valuable long-range Tu-95s. Those are, Russia's not even been able to make those since they no longer have the tooling and the manufacturing capabilities. So they're essentially irreplaceable. But probably the biggest prize for Ukraine was the destruction of Russia's A-50 airborne early warning aircraft. Like the Tu-95, Russia can no longer make these, and they are critical for the ongoing war against Ukraine. They provide all kinds of intelligence to Russian pilots in other nearby aircraft, intelligence related to air defense systems and guided missiles and targeting intel as well. And Russia only has a handful of these A-50s. So destroying even just that one plane was a serious blow. Satellite imagery and video footage have confirmed several of these losses for Russia, but not all of them. And Russia so far has been quiet about the attack. So basically right now we mostly just have Ukrainian claims to go by, and those have not been confirmed. So there are still plenty of unknowns. But if this attack was even half as devastating as it appears to be, then it was a game changer. Just a very real material reduction of Russian air power and Russia's ability to wage war. This may have taken out 1/3 of Russia's heavy bombers. So just extremely disruptive to the Russian war machine and a major embarrassment to Vladimir Putin's Russia in general.
Then in the background to this is happening, what we've seen headlines about increased Russian attacks on Ukraine and an increased push to have some kind of peace negotiation. I mean, obviously, we've been used to this war going on in Europe for several years now. It's easy to kind of tune out some of the headlines about attacks on Ukrainian cities and things like that. What is the immediate background to what we saw this weekend?
Yes, well, the war, it has been raging now for about 40 months. The full-scale war on Ukraine. It's hard to believe that it has been raging for that long, but it was all the way back in February of 2022 that Putin's forces, tens of thousands of them, first rolled into Ukraine from several different locations, aiming to quickly, decapitate the nation and assert control over the whole territory. And in those early weeks, the Russians did manage to seize about 30% of Ukraine's territory. But on the whole, of course, we know now that it didn't go the way Putin planned. His forces were met with far more resistance than they'd expected, and the Ukrainians have fought them ever since then with greater determination than most anyone would have expected. And Ukraine has actually pushed Russia back a great deal over these 40 months on the whole. Today, Russia has only control over about 19 or 20% of Ukraine's territory, down from about 30% in the early months of the war. But over this last year, though, Russia has been gaining ground, usually just a few yards at a time, maybe a kilometer or so at a time. So Russia has been gaining ground in recent months, but it has come at an extremely high cost. Actually, later this month, before the end of June, we expect Russia to hit a very grim milestone, and that is 1 million casualties, 1 million soldiers dead or wounded. So just a stunning number, especially when you consider that in the Soviet-Afghan War, Russia's total casualties were only about 75,000. That was 15,000 dead and 60,000 wounded. And with the Soviet-Afghan War, those losses were enough to make Russia admit defeat and retreat out of Afghanistan. But here we are with Ukraine, and the Russians have more than 10 times those losses. We're looking at 1 million casualties by the end of June. And Russia right now shows no signs of backing down. Now, these devastating strikes on their bombers are adding, of course, a great deal to the strain that Russia's facing. And then we also just learned this morning that Ukraine has struck the Crimea Bridge for the third time. So there are plenty of cards that Ukraine is still playing. Turns out they did have some cards, but this is all adding up to be just a heavy albatross on the Russian neck. But at the same time, Putin seems, on the whole, undeterred, and he seems determined to keep on trying to take all that he can. So it is a grim milestone that we're approaching, but it does not seem to mean that the end is in sight.
And I think the timing of this attack is interesting for a couple of reasons. One report that I saw highlighted that this attack came on the anniversary of I think it was at least one event to do with the signing of the Budapest Memorandum, where Ukraine gave up its own nuclear weapons in return for a guarantee from Russia, the United States, Britain, and then later France, that these nations would come to Ukraine's defense if they were ever attacked. So I think there's something powerfully symbolic that Ukraine was attacking Russia's nuclear infrastructure on the anniversary of a day where they gave up their own nuclear weapons and gave them to Russia. And some of these nuclear-capable bombers and things like that were once stationed in Ukraine. So I think there's a powerful reminder there. They're reminding, the world of the broken promises that have been made. More immediately, this happened in the background of these pushes for peace talks. How do you see this playing into peace talks, and where are we right now? Is this a way of raising the cost of continuing the war for Vladimir Putin so that he does sign some kind of a ceasefire, or is it only going to spur him now to kind of try and take revenge and save face?
Yes, an extremely relevant question given where we are with the efforts to broker some kind of a peace deal. United States President Donald Trump, of course, has been working very hard to bring about some sort of a deal. And the hallmark of President Trump's approach has been to try to appease Russia, trying to flatter Vladimir Putin, trying to give Putin as much as he can, really, to try to in hopes that that would persuade Putin to opt for peace. And then on the other hand, President Trump has also blamed Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky for starting the war. On the whole, Mr. Trump's approach has been extremely baffling to onlookers around the world. It's been quite embarrassing for Americans to see our leader behaving in this naive and puerile way. And it's also been totally ineffective. Just today, a second round of direct talks between Russia and Ukraine took place in Istanbul, and they did hash out a prisoner exchange, and they also hashed out an agreement to repatriate a bunch of bodies of dead soldiers from both sides. But there continues to be a great gulf fixed between the two sides. The two sides are miles apart on what the terms would have to be for a real ceasefire, much less a broader peace. It basically comes down to Russia demanding the entirety of 5 regions, much of which Russia has not even been able to assert control over during these 40 months of war. He wants full control of Donetsk, Kherson, Luhansk, and Zaporizhia, as well as Crimea, of course. And with Kherson and Zaporizhia in particular, the Russians have nothing even approaching full control. And then on the other side of it, Ukraine is basically saying that Russia could keep what it does currently control, but no more. But that's not good enough for Russia. Putin demands all of it. And his government sometimes even reiterates that they want the entire nation of Ukraine. So there is still just a great gulf fixed between these two. And it means that peace is very elusive and it does not appear to be near. I do think that this attack adds to the Russian pressure. As you said, I think it makes the cost of continuing the war quite a bit higher for Putin, but I don't think that that'll be enough to persuade him to back down.
So I want to pivot a bit and bring Josue into the discussion now. Josue, you had an article that went up on Monday night, Ukraine's attack on Russia, a wake-up call for America. Like we said in the introduction, this is the latest example of where a smaller power uses new technology and cheaper technology in a really resourceful way to inflict great damage on a more powerful adversary. In this case, it was Ukraine against Russia, but really, at least in terms of money spent on defense, there is no more powerful adversary than the United States. So if it can happen to Russia, and if this allows a smaller power to really badly hurt Russia, how vulnerable is the United States to that same kind of attack?
Quite a lot of lessons we can learn from this. As you said, as Jeremiah even alluded to, those drones that were used, they were very cheap comparatively. They weren't even those kind of military drones that some large military would produce. They were commercial drones, you could say, and then they were targeted at those military fighter jets. And Russia, we have to remember, they are currently in a full-scale war, so they would expect an attack on their military bases. That's one of the bases that you would want to protect most in times of war. So how was it that they were able to be surprised by a smaller foe, as it was brought out? Now, there are a few things. It was a surprise attack. Despite it being a large-scale war that they engaged in, they were able to surprise Russia. But also it's noteworthy that Russia was not prepared to protect their military bases against smaller drone attacks. Certainly they were prepared if there was a bomber coming around and was about to drop bombs there. Surely they would have shot a large plane down. Surely they would have shot down medium-sized planes or even larger drones. But they were not expecting that smaller drones could be within the nation, within reach, and that they then could reach those military targets. It's also interesting what role artificial intelligence has played here, because I have read a few reports that those drones, the software, the AI software was trained on those military planes because they have them in the museum. So those larger planes that have been around for quite a few years and even decades in some cases, their vulnerabilities were exactly known, they could be studied, and then a small drone could be trained to target the most vulnerable spots to create the greatest damage. So you have a small drone, very cheap, designed to make the most damage. So for a few $100s, you could make millions of dollars of damage. In total, it was billions of dollars if the numbers are right. So that shows what a terrorist actor could do. And I'm sure lots of terrorist organizations are looking at that. And we know that the United States is vulnerable to terrorist attacks. We have seen that in many cases, 9/11 being the most famous case, where they had to hijack large aircraft. But if you imagine that a terrorist usually has to risk his own life to be able to cause the greatest amount of damage. With drone warfare, you don't have that risk anymore. You can have multiple drones, and the operator doesn't even have to risk their own lives to create damage like that. And as you said, there's no greater military than the United States at the moment. There's no greater economic power in that sense, rivaling with China, of course, as the United States. So the vulnerability to create the greatest amount of damage in a nation like that is the greatest. And we can go through a few examples that go beyond the military bases that are targets. You can think about infrastructure that is enormous in America, how much everything depends on the electricity grid. You can think about distribution of foods. What if you can attack the supply chains in that regard? What if you can attack the sewers? Right now we have a lot of drones that spray fertilizers over fields. What if you can get in there as a terrorist and instead of the fertilizer you spray some kind of a poison, a biological weapon, a chemical weapon just over the fields, or you get that drone into a large population. So basically, if you can think of any vulnerability America has, if you can think of any scenario that would cause them to be crippled in certain ways, you can think about it. A terrorist probably thinks about it too, and it's just a matter of time till they're able to pull it off.
And I think this broader setup is important because I've seen discussion online about, okay, could you do this to an American military base? And there's been kind of discussions as to how advanced America's anti-drone capabilities are around military bases and, you know, lasers or signal interrupters or putting the weapons inside hardened hangars, and how much have we done? In some ways, that's kind of misses the point. I think the discussion is less about could you replicate this very specific attack on the United States, and more about exactly the wider trends that you were talking about, this kind of thing. And I think what this demonstrates is we are reaching a changing stage in warfare. And to kind of step back and take a bit of a broad sweep on how technology changes in warfare, like you do get fundamental almost tides and shifts that happen. You go back to throughout the 19th century, you have rifle technology come a long way. And you kind of go from the American Revolutionary War and the Napoleonic War, where rifles were used, but most people had muskets that can't be aimed, to US Civil War, where now muskets are kind of rifles are the main weapon of the infantry. And this fundamentally changes the whole dynamic of attack and defense. Suddenly, it is incredibly hard to attack an adversary in an entrenched position. And this culminates in World War I, where everything just bogs down. It becomes really, really hard once you have rifles, machine guns, accurate artillery. It becomes incredibly hard to attack an entrenched position. And by the time you get to World War II, things have shifted again. And now you have tanks, you have aircraft, you have these things that can be used together in concert. And the Nazis are kind of the first to do this. And suddenly this static mode of thinking is out of date, and you can run circles around an opponent whose head is kind of in the old mode of doing things. And the German military takes over Europe, not because they're necessarily spending more or that they have more weapons than, say, the French military, but they're using this technology much better, and they understand the dynamics that have shifted in the military. And I think we're having a similar shift in dynamics, whether it's drones in particular, whether it's just miniaturization in general, that you can miniaturize electronics, which then means you can smuggle it behind enemy lines, like Ukraine did, that make it incredibly hard to deal with. You can see how then that could be used against the United States. You know, you can smuggle vast amounts of drugs into the United States. You can smuggle in vast amounts of enemy military hardware. And like you said, it's almost like the limit is just the imagination. But for America, okay, maybe they are defending against the potential for drone attacks on their strategic bombers. But there's so many potential avenues. It feels almost impossible to defend against them all. So it really seems like it shifts the whole dynamic to an attacker and somebody that does, like, it's just much easier to carry out these attacks and bring down an enemy than it is to defend against them. I think, Jeremiah, maybe I could just put you on the spot a little bit. You've written about some of the way that Russia and China have kind of prepared the way to be the attacker in these circumstances. This is what Ukraine is doing is what gets called asymmetric warfare, where instead of going aircraft carrier for aircraft carrier, soldier for soldier, bomber for bomber, the weaker power looks at what can we do innovatively to attack our enemy in kind of unique ways. And Russia and China have prepared for years for asymmetric warfare against the United States. I'm thinking in particular, I've got an article in front of me that you wrote, Jeremiah, a couple of years ago. Each Chinese ship is a ship of war, where you kind of talk about how China's civilian ships are designed so that they can play a role in warfare. I have an article here from 2010 that is talking about Russia militarizing shipping containers and developing missile systems that can be put in shipping containers so that you can have a civilian-looking ship and yet it can launch missiles at you and then go back to just looking like a shipping container again. This kind of miniaturization is part of a fundamental shift in warfare that's been going on for some time, but these attacks are just kind of demonstrating. I mean, do you have anything to add on the way that Russia and China have kind of been preparing to launch or to have that kind of capability of themselves?
If you look at your grandfather's war, World War II, something along those lines, just a strictly conventional war, the Russians and the Chinese for decades have understood that they will lose that war against America. And so they've been preparing for something quite different. And the Chinese have, as you said, they've been looking ahead in a way that has prompted them to make all of their, even fishing vessels, are ready so that when the time comes, all they really have to do is flip the switch. And suddenly these thousands of ships are ready to accommodate People's Liberation Army armaments and soldiers. They're even built in many cases with specifications that will make them ready to suddenly become warships. And we've also seen, even just when it comes to research and development, for the United States to maintain its cutting edge, to be at the vanguard of innovation, it's extremely expensive. It's very costly to be exploring new avenues, testing new technologies, many of which prove to be ineffective. And so you've wasted billions of dollars finding out that, this given technology does not work. But the Russians and Chinese are not spending in those ways. They're not trying to innovate. They're not spending a lot on R&D. Instead, they will see what America produces that does work. They'll get their hands on some blueprints. They'll reverse engineer it. And soon they're manufacturing the same weapons for, maybe 5% of the cost, because they didn't have to do the initial innovation, the initial R&D and whatnot. And so America, if you just look at the dollar amounts that the US military is spending, it's more than I think the next 10 countries combined. But if you look at what those dollars are actually accomplishing compared to what a Chinese yuan or a Russian ruble accomplishes, it really does start to get evened out a little bit, because they are not trying to maintain the edge, which is very costly. They're just kind of replicating what already works.
A great point. Josue, just back to you on your article that you had on Monday, Ukraine's attack on Russia, wake-up call for America. one of the points you make there is the way that a lot of these systems, some of which Jeremiah's been talking about, some of which they're more just say like drones and AI, that Ukraine has been a testing ground for these, kind of in the way that the Spanish Civil War acted as a testing ground for the weapons that went on to be used in World War II. I mean, what can you tell us about the way that other powers have been very closely monitoring what's been happening in the Russia-Ukraine war to learn lessons from exactly the kind of thing that we saw this weekend?
Yeah, as Jeremiah pointed out, it's a war that has been going on for 3 years, and it's a large-scale war. And it's a war that is every day there's constant conflict and battles and deaths. So there's a lot of lessons from military strategic point of views, but in this instance specifically, technology has played a huge amount of a role because Ukraine does not have as much of a military edge. So they really are dependent on modern technologies to be able to sustain their fighting. That has caused them to be creative. This has caused them to be more innovative. Since 2014, they have been using drones, and they have been importing them and then developing their own drones, and they have been using them in battle. But in this since 2022, more and more foreign investors have been coming into Ukraine to study what Ukraine is doing, to see how they can improve what they are doing, to see how the foreign weapon systems can be used in their field to get them an edge with low cost and with easy way to deploy those technologies that a simple Ukrainian soldier can deploy them on the front. So I'm from Germany and I studied Germany in particular, but of course there's also American military companies that are involved with these things. But Germany, for example, very early on, startups from Munich have gone to Ukraine and they have looked at what Ukraine are doing. And from there on, they have developed their business around basically catering to Ukraine's needs and seeing how they can develop their drones to be able to then be able to confront Russia, be able to be resistant to jamming attacks, and be able to target a specific Russian forces in a very calculated way. So it's very specific to Russia, but also those lessons obviously can be employed to other military forces that may be coming their way. And it has co-aligned with the advances in artificial intelligence, which happened around the same time. People remember when ChatGPT came around and we were all excited about the answers this can be giving. But around the same time, it was also military AI that took a drastic increase. And it was mainly because of the war in Ukraine that furthered all these developments, because you produce more weaponry, you get more money, and you have more money for researching as well, and nations are more willing to spend more money on research. So they're looking at the lessons from Ukraine. And because Ukraine has been using so much drone warfare, the drone warfare was specifically advanced in that regard.
Now, you mentioned Germany there. We've most focused more on Russia and China, as they have been much more open about developing asymmetric warfare and even showing off some of their capabilities. You, of course, mentioning the role that Germany played in there. And this is something that Trumpet Editor-in-Chief Gerald Flurry has focused on a lot because of some specific Bible prophecies. And in particular, the rise of a strong man in Germany that understands these technologies particularly well. And I just wanted to play a clip. You talked about some of this in your article, but I wanted to play a clip from a Key of David program that he gave, I think, a little over a year ago, where he talks about one of these prophecies.
Verse 9 of chapter 8 in Daniel. Verse 9 says this, "And out of one of them came forth a little horn, which waxed exceeding great toward the south and toward the east and toward the pleasant land," or Jerusalem. So the main end-time fulfillment of Daniel's prophecy will occur in Europe. That is this artificial intelligence. And we explain a lot about what's going to happen in Europe in our book on the Holy Roman Empire. Now, if you look at Antiochus here, anciently it shows that he had an abnormal interest in technology. Now, this is a type. This is from a book that's only for the end time. 2 verses tell you that in Daniel 12, verses 4 and 9. Antiochus anciently shows that he had an abnormal interest in technology. Polybius Histories, the historian, relates that Antiochus often wandered in the city streets, holding forth at length and discussing technical matters with the molders and other craftsmen. The men fulfilling the roles of this modern Antiochus have similar interest in much more modern technologies. It's just the way Antiochus is, and this Antiochus is, well, he's controlled by an evil spirit, the main evil spirit in this universe. And we need to think about that. If we believe the Bible, and if we don't believe it, well, it's still going to come true. And we're going to all see that, and we can see it right now. Prophecy is being fulfilled like never before on this earth. And I hope that we can help you understand that. But going on, it says, quoting this historian, holding forth at length and discussing technical matters with molders and other craftsmen, the men fulfilling the roles of the modern Antiochus, that have the modern technology.
So a bit of a longer clip there, but fascinating in context of this discussion, that the book of Daniel is a book of prophecy. Jesus Christ himself talks about Daniel's prophecy and says, well, you need to understand that, go back and understand the abomination of desolation that's spoken of by Daniel the prophet. And he makes clear that, there's bits of the book of Daniel that had been fulfilled before Jesus Christ came to the earth, but ultimately the big fulfillment of the book of Daniel is in the end time. So this ancient Antiochus, Daniel prophesied of that ancient Antiochus in advance, but he's only a type of an end-time leader. But we can look at this ancient Antiochus, this ruler in the Middle East, and learn things about him, and that tells us about what this modern strong leader in Germany is going to be like. And one of those things is he'll understand how to use some of this modern technology. And we've been looking for an individual that does that. Joshua, what can you tell us about, you mentioned a few German companies, but Germany in particular, as they look at using these kind of technologies?
Yes, now that Germany is investing more in military applications, they're investing a lot in innovation, obviously. And this time around, it's really the startups that can make a massive difference. And one of the startups was the Helsing startup that developed drones for Ukraine, and that's how they made their money, and it's Munich-based. And then they are also developing underwater drones that are able to detect ships, submarines, down to their class, down to exactly which type they are, and they can be underwater for 3 months in swarms, undetected, with almost no energy costs for them. And then if you just think about the implications on how Germany can use all of these advances that they're investing in right now for military surprises, it is an unprecedented time to be able to have such an advantage as a larger military power, much larger than Ukraine. And you mentioned that we are looking for a man that is interested in these kinds of advances and technologies. And our editor-in-chief, Mr. Jeremiah, has been pointing to Karl Theodor zu Guttenberg as the man to watch. And he has been in 2009 to 2011 economics minister, then defense minister, and he has been then very interested in technology. But ever since, he has been studying the fields of artificial intelligence, the fields of robotics, and all the fields that are also dual-use fields because they can be used in military applications. He has talked about cyber warfare being enhanced by artificial intelligence. And he is investing in some of those military startups in the Munich area. So if you see the grand scale of things, Germany is not investing in the military technologies of all times. As you brought out earlier, the advantage this time is not with the defender, it's with the attacker, because the defender always has to think about what the attacker might be, and how likely is it that they will always be right about what the attacker could be doing next. If the attacker has an innovative idea that the defender did not think about, it could be more deadly today than it was ever before.
A good point. And I just wanted to bring up another a couple of clips from that Key of David program where Mr. Flurry even zooms in on a phrase that is used in the book of Daniel that could well apply to a lot of these modern technologies. Here's another clip.
Now notice Daniel 8 and verse 23. Here's what it says. And in the latter time of their kingdom, when the transgressors are come to the full, a king of fierce countenance and understanding dark sentences shall stand up. Well, dark sentences, understanding dark sentences? Well, isn't that what AI is all about? If you look at the negative side of it, well, it certainly is. But it's going to stand up. The expression dark sentences comes from the word Hadah, which means riddle, difficult, question, parable. That's from the theological word book of the Old Testament. This expression could also mean difficult technology. It's puzzling. There's a lot they don't understand about it. And it's capable of being, well, filled with dark sentences. Dark sentences, the Hebrew Chaldee lexicon defines it this way: twisted, involved, subtlety, fraud, enigma. To many today, AI is an enigma. Yes, it is. But this man, this strong man in Europe, is going to come on the scene, and he's going to know and understand these dark sentences, perhaps better than most. And he's using it for a very evil purpose. Dark sentences. See, that really defines AI if you think about it. Now, there may be other issues there or ingredients there, but it certainly has the AI ingredient.
And as you pointed out, AI, drones, a lot of that goes together. There was a combination of that used in this attack. It seems like they used AI to work out, well, what are the most vulnerable spots to target on these planes? And then they had a human being piloting the drones once they're inside Russia. The human being piloting the drone is kind of a vulnerability. If you can interrupt the signal between the drone and the pilot, the drone, you've stopped the drone, giving the drone some kind of intelligence, an ability to work with other drones is an obvious way around that. Like, a lot of this can all tie together very, very easily. But there's one more quote I just wanted to bring up here, because I think it's very prescient in light of what we just saw. The final clip.
And there will be dark sentences. Just the word sentences itself, that means something twisted or fraud or dark and twisted. That's what it means. They're defining AI. And the Bible is defining it essentially the same way. And even more effectively, I think, telling you how deadly this is, and yet they are racing to use it in their military so they can guide robots with nuclear bombs and fly these nuclear bombs all over the earth in drones. And they can knock out the technology of their enemy, and where they can't even use their nuclear bombs or their other dangerous ingredients there. Germany's Luftwaffe is experimenting with drone swarms and investing in artificial intelligence solutions for controlling German drones and destroying enemy drones. They're working to overcome the Cold War mutually assured destruction, which means they knew that, well, we'll just destroy each other, so there's nothing we can do, and they didn't use their nuclear bombs. But here, now you might be able to knock out the other guy's technology, and he can't even fire his missiles. This is dangerously evil, the way we're talking about it here in prophecy. But they can send these things all over the world, and let me tell you, Germany is ahead of America in this field.
And that is pretty much what we saw. I mean, or a picture of it. Okay, it wasn't, Ukraine didn't take out the entirety of Russia's defense force. I mean, they didn't take out the entirety of their bombers. There's also, Russia has land, vehicle launched ICBMs that driving around the forests of Siberia that can be launched from the back of a truck. They've got submarine launched ICBMs. There's other components here, but we saw that demonstrated, like that you can do that you can use some of this new technology to try and take out an enemy's nuclear force. And in this case, bombers that launch strategic nuclear weapons, among other things that Jeremiah outlined at the start of the show. We got a picture of that happening. So, and that was Ukraine. So are we getting to the position where a more capable power could maybe dream of taking out all of an enemy country's nuclear arsenal, most of America's nuclear arsenal, enough to the point where mutually assured destruction is no longer a factor, where with enough planning, enough intelligence gathering, we could say take out all of the enemy's nuclear weapons, and then we can strike them and not fear being struck back. And there's a lot of factors that have gone into the fact we haven't had a world war since World War II, but mutually assured destruction has been a major part of that. So if that starts to go away, are we in a world where a kind of a world war starting with a surprise attack becomes feasible, possible? You bring into that situation stories that we've been hearing for years now about problems in guarding America's nuclear weapons. If you're an ambitious officer in the US military that really wants to serve your country, you're probably not going to end up in the nuclear forces. I'm sure that there are some people in there that are ambitious and talented, but generally they don't see action. They haven't seen action for years. You don't really want them to see action. You're probably going to be dedicating yourself elsewhere. And there've been generals in charge of American nuclear weapons getting arrested, drunk in Moscow, pizza delivery guys being called to American nuclear bases, finding the doors propped open, answers to tests that soldiers have to take being posted online or texted around, nuclear weapons being left on runways unguarded. There's a lot that a vigilant enemy could do to build up a picture, to use to use other factors of asymmetric warfare, cyber hacking, even just monitoring lots of people. Then throw that into AI and big data, and if we give 100 million data points from all over America, can we then calculate and cross-reference that and work out where most of the nuclear weapons are? And then can we combine that with drone technology? And you start to see how you can have the end of mutually assured destruction and enemies dreaming of taking America out on the first strike. And this is where, Josue, you bring in another prophecy in the book of Ezekiel that describes very much that scenario that we're kind of really seeing with this technology.
Yeah, and just to build on what you just said, if a nation really prepares for that, and the late Herbert W. Armstrong has said that, and it's well documented in 1996, it was revealed, declassified, that Germany has been preparing since World War II, before even losing the World War, that they would plan for another round. And for decades, military leaders that have been going underground and others have been preparing for this exact scenario that you just have been describing. And we have been warning about it for decades as well, beginning with the late Herbert W. Armstrong. But the prophecy that you're alluding to is in Ezekiel 7, verse 14, where it says that the trumpet will be blown, but the military, they won't go into battle. And why is that? In the 1990s, Editor-in-Chief Mr. J.F. Lewis said, it's likely going to be a cyber attack. And cyber vulnerabilities have become ever greater since, with the satellite technologies, but also with artificial intelligence. The United States military is increasingly dependent on those new technologies as well. And Germany is the World War II enemy, but today it's an ally. So they are cooperating on the NATO level with America. They are studying American warplanes together. They have strategic insight into all that America is doing. Ukraine planned a recent attack for a year and a half. Germany had decades to prepare a much larger attack. We don't tend to think about it because we see Germany as an ally today, but they are filled with revenge and they are filled with strategic planners. And now couple that with artificial intelligence, they can make war plans that are beyond what humans can think of. If you have a surprise attack in World War II, it was manageable by a few commanders that were able to see the oversight. But if you now combine the different strategic attacks on infrastructure, on the command centers, on the military bases, you have the different weapon systems of small tactical nuclear weapons to larger nuclear weapons, of biological weapons, of chemical weapons, of the cyber attacks that we mentioned earlier. And if you try all of those things, and if of the 500, of the 5,000, of the 5 million attacks that you are planning, half of them or only 10% work out, you're creating so much chaos in a nation that the population will be dazzled and they will be frightened and they don't know where the next attack will be coming from. So those are some frightening scenarios, but that prophecy in Ezekiel says that they will be successful in surprising America, so much so that the military that has been prepared for all kinds of scenarios will be overwhelmed, so much so that they will not be able to go to battle when the attacker comes.
And one final prophecy I think that's worth talking about that you touched on in your article. We do have these descriptions in the book of Revelation and elsewhere that describe modern weapon systems, that describe the Apostle John, a man living in the 1st century, seeing these visions that don't really relate to the type of weapons he's used to seeing, and he's describing them in kind of pictured form. And I think for several decades you've been able to see modern weapons in those descriptions. But with some of these drones and some of these others, I think we're seeing that more clearly, and they even more closely match some of these latest weapons. And you mentioned a little bit of that in your article. So can you tell us how some of these weapons that we're seeing now match some of those prophecies?
Yeah, and the prophecy in Revelation 9, it talks about swarms of locusts. And if you imagine a swarm of locusts, you can't count how many locusts are in there with your bare eye, and they're swarming in a coordinated fashion, and they don't collide with each other. They're going for a specific purpose, and they might be devastating a harvest crop, and then they move on and they go through cities. But the point is that what would a weapon system look like that looks like a swarm of different parts? Now, we talk regularly these days in the last few years of swarms of locusts. And if you consider that 1,000 drones a few years ago would have had to be coordinated by 1,000 human beings. But with the help of artificial intelligence, those drones can be coordinated, that they don't collide, that they go for a specific target. And then when they reach their target, just like in the case of these Ukrainian drones, they went for individual airplanes and for the individual parts and for the most vulnerable parts to be able to make the greatest damage. Now, if you have a swarm of 1,000 drones and they go into a city and to target specific areas, they can be designed to go there and without a single human being do their dirty work from there on. And the cheaper the drone is, the more mass-produced it can be. And in one scenario, I have read about the use of bumblebee drones. They're just the size of a bumblebee, which is very similar to the size of a locust even, and you could coordinate them. And the point that the author was making of that book was that they could be trained, if they go for an army of military soldiers, to just go for the most vulnerable spot. For example, if you have a human being, the most vulnerable spot might be the eyeball. And if you just have the smallest little explosion, you can go right to the brain. But that's just an example of finding the most vulnerable spot using the smallest explosion possible to make the greatest amount of damage. Now, if you would have to have that coordinated by a human being, it would be not effective. But if you have a swarm, just like it's described in Revelation 9, a swarm of military aircraft, coupled with a swarm of military drones, from the largest to the smallest, it is indeed frightening. And the people have described it as worse as a nuclear weapon because it's so hard to defend against it. So we really see that prophecy fulfilled in a way that we couldn't imagine a few years ago, because we ourselves at the trumpet have been wondering what it would be described. It's clearly an end-time prophecy, so we thought maybe helicopters. And helicopters may be part of it. They make a noise like a locust. But if you now see it with the combination of other aircraft, unarmed aircraft, the swarm makes a lot more sense now.
Well, thanks for that, Josue. That's a great point. And you can read more about this whole story in Ukraine's attack on Russia, a wake-up call for America. I'll also mention an article that is mentioned in that one, AI and the End of Mutually Assured Destruction by Mr. Flurry, that gets into, again, what we saw with the end of mutually assured destruction. And a final book that I'll mention, especially going off that last subject, Unveiled at Last, the Royal Book of Revelation. And I think this one is definitely worth concluding with, because this is a subject that, as we're having this discussion, I found it fascinating, but it does kind of get pretty dark when you hear about autonomous weapon systems that go for the eyes, like you were describing, Josue. That's some pretty terrifying stuff. And I think it's important to see that in its context. And that's really what this book, Unveiled at Last, the Royal Book of Revelation, does. That there are some very sobering prophecies in the book of Revelation that you're talking about, but that book itself is just filled with so much light and so much hope. And yes, there are some pretty scary weapon systems that are being developed. And even the end of mutually assured destruction, the prospect of nuclear war, absolutely a very scary subject, a very serious, a very sobering subject. But just knowing that God prophesied this time and got into all of those specifics thousands of years ago brings in so much hope here too. Like, this is not random chance. This is not something happening that God didn't account for. God knew this would happen. He allowed for this to happen. He allowed for us to be in this place. And all of this is unfolding according to his plan for mankind. And ultimately, it's about bringing repentance to all of mankind. It's about freeing mankind from this world that is Satan's evil world and bringing them into a world that's in obedience to God's law and giving mankind the opportunity to obey God's law and live the way of life that leads to blessings and light. And I'll just read, this is from that book, Unveiled at Last, the Royal Book of Revelation. Mr. Flurry writes, the world usually views the book of Revelation somewhat like a horror movie. And I think, Josue, some of the things that you were describing were somewhat like a horror movie. Mr. Flurry says the Greek word for revelation is apocalypse. It conjures up pictures of terrifying calamity to most people. But the word actually means an uncovering or disclosure, to enlighten or give light. Revelation should reveal light to men. Instead, it is the most misunderstood book in the Bible. God reveals it only to babes, saints with a childlike, teachable attitude. What should give this world light instead pictures the darkest kind of horror. Because they've rejected God's light, people of this world cause their own dark and punishing tribulation. People redefine apocalypse to their own shame. The catastrophe comes upon those people who are rebelling against God's law, which is almost everybody. But in spite of their blindness, this book is still filled with hope. And so that book will give you the hope behind some of these prophecies as well. So if your curiosity has been piqued by some of these prophecies and what we've been talking about and fulfilled prophecy, I think that's a great place to go to learn more about that as well. Unveiled at Last, the Royal Book of Revelation, and all of our articles, all of these different books and booklets, they're all free. You can get them on our website, thetrumpet.com. We'll put links to the articles to that book as well, and you can read it online. You can order your own free print copy. You can download a PDF. You can go to our website. You can add it to basket. We still just use the language of e-commerce, I guess, but it's free. There's no shipping costs. There's nothing like that. We're happy to send it out to you anywhere in the world. It's not restricted to the United States. We will send that out to you, and you can study that alongside your Bible and see the incredible light behind some of the darkest headlines in this world news. Well, thank you very much to my guests here, Jeremiah Jacques and Josue Michels. I think it's just been a really fascinating conversation. Thanks to George Haddad and Adiel Granados for engineering and production. Thank you for you, the viewer, and you can get in touch with us at trumpetworld@thetrumpet.com. We're very happy to get your comments and feedback. We'll be back with our regular Week in Review show on Friday, and until then, keep watching your world.